You need to learn how to fail. And you have to fail once a day to be a great artist or a great designer. That's really important. My name is Allan Wexler. I grew up in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and currently live in both New York City, in the neighborhood of Chelsea, and I also have a home on the North Fork of Long Island where I have another studio. I would say our lives are full of drama and theater, but we ignore it. We don't understand it. So I'm trying to bring theater to everyday life, to make the ordinary into something that's special. And I think I've done that throughout my career. I studied architecture, but was more suited to working privately. Architecture is a great collaborative art form, but I'm a bit of a private person and I like the loneliness of the studio. There's nothing I like more than working alone on a quiet day, just building and making and letting that generate ideas. I don't think before I build. I build and then think, and then I rebuild. My father was a professional photographer, and I loved working with him in the darkroom. And he was a commercial photographer and an industrial photographer. And my grandfather was a sign painter, and my other grandfather was a tailor. So I think there was a kind of visual language in my family. Neither of them really my mother or father would consider themselves artists, but they encouraged a kind of creativity in me. Growing up, I always liked making things as a child, but I always thought I was destined to be an academic, a scientist, and then realized toward high school that I really found most pleasure in working with tools. And my older brother convinced me that I perhaps should study architecture. So I studied architecture at Rhode Island School of Design, but was more, I felt more an affinity toward the art students at RISD and other artists who are working in sculpture, painting. I think one of the issues was, as a high school student, I was what you might call a very good student, which meant I memorized facts, but I couldn't think on my own. And then when I went to college and studied, I started loosening up and I became more of a rebel and started to create irritation with my faculty and trying to, quote, break the rules, and I started loosening up. I think especially in the United States at least, perhaps other countries not so much, but we're too goal-oriented. When students in schools, especially grammar schools and high schools, always think there is a right way and a wrong way, and there is a goal, and you have to have your idea before you begin. But with many writers, musicians, artists, the work evolves through the making. That you always hear about writers talking about the character evolves as I write. It's not premeditated. So I don't want to premeditate, because then you end up with cliche. So I let the making help me discover through accident, through the smell of the wood, through the tools. I could talk about all of the artists in my past that have inspired me. For instance, probably Marcel Duchamp, who's a major influence on me. I didn't know him personally, of course, but I did get to meet one of my other important influences was John Cage, who, although a composer, I became very interested in his thinking and the use of kind of a meditative use of chance operation and being setting up rules through which you could break preconceptions about the way the world should be. So yes, I would say John Cage, Marcel Duchamp were great influences, but also Andy Warhol. I wanted to be the Andy Warhol of architecture. And I found my name, Allan Wexler, A-W, had the same initials as Andy Warhol, A-W. So I said, I'm going to be the Andy Warhol of architecture. I wanted to be that person who could interrogate and irritate at the same time, like Warhol, I think, did. And I had the pleasure of being represented by Ronald Feldman Gallery for many years, where I had 10 solo exhibitions, and Ron Feldman was the publisher of Andy Warhol's prints. So there was a tie-in there. So although those are not living artists, and I do spend time in galleries seeing what's out there, and there are many artists that I have great admiration for. But I'm reluctant to say one of those as a major influence on who I am today, or becoming. What is art to me is a question I've been trying to figure out for my entire career, probably even earlier than I was as a student. Especially the difference between art and architecture. Again, I was trained as an architect, but I was drawn toward the fine arts. But what's the difference? Is it that an artist creates problems and an architect solves problems? Is it that the, quote, client of an artist is the self? The work is self-directed, and the work of a designer is externally directed. And I remember, back to Warhol again, Warhol once said, perhaps in his book on the philosophy of Andy Warhol, From A to B, that if he could hire anyone, he would hire a boss. One of the beautiful things about being a designer is you have a boss to tell you what to do. And that boss, or that direction, helps you focus, because there are too many possibilities. So the luxury of having a boss or having a client is it narrows your experimentation. So an artist has to self-direct, has to narrow their focus, whereas an architect, the focus is determined by an external source. I don't know if that's so clear, but it's a question that I probably will continue to ask forever. And I don't think I can resolve. There is no real answer to that question. What is an artist? Is an artist about a person who helps people see the world around them more closely, to appreciate life by looking at what is ignored? Maybe. Art will always be a mystery to me. When the mystery of art is resolved, I think that's the end. Then there's no need to do any more work. So I'm always searching, but hopefully there's no resolution in that search. There's a series of discoveries along the way, but it opens up new areas of exploration. What I try to discover in my art is myself. I think the work I'm doing today is not unlike the work I did when I was a young student. I'm trying to explore who I am in the world and my position in the world. So it's always about self-discovery. So yeah, I think that's what it's about, self-discovery. That project over here called Bucket House, this was a project. I built one of these full size in Germany when I had an exhibition there a while back.
Also counterweights here.
And the counterweights, like the cottage.
Yeah.
What happens?
With the buckets for the rain collection?
Yes. So what happens is, I'm making a big thing about water and rain as a precious commodity. And so when it rains, the water goes into gutters and drains into the earth. But here, because water is so precious, I'm trying to collect every raindrop that comes off the roof of this building. So as the rain comes down off the roof, it collects in these buckets. When the buckets get too heavy and they're heavier than the counterweight, they come down to the ground, and then you harvest the water like you harvest, grapes. And the water, when you empty the bucket, rises back up to the roof, collects more water, draws to the ground. Because all the buckets are different sizes, they don't all come down to the ground at the same time. Because if they did, we'd be wasting all that water. So it gives you the time to empty the bucket, and then it rises back up, and then another one empties. So it's like a complete cycle. If I become an expert at making something or using a particular tool, or I then get skeptical and I develop a new project that requires me to learn a new technique or a new tool, I feel sometimes expertise gets in the way of search and research and experimentation and exploration. So the more I get better at the craft of making, the more I try to uncraft and unmake in order to break preconceptions and to go beyond what I already know. The tool is a chisel, not for chiseling wood, but it's also a lever that pries ideas out of your mind. It's a tool for excavating ideas, emotions, passion. Sculpture versus painting, probably because I love tools. I will often buy a tool or find a tool at a yard sale or a flea market and then use that tool to make a project. Sometimes the tool generates the ideas and the work. So in a way, I'm a tool guy. I love the physicality of tools. I collect antique tools. They're around me. They are extensions not just of my hands, but of my mind. And I think that's really critical. So I do love painting, and I love the smell of oil and linseed oil, but I like the dimensionality of sculpture. And I like the materials. I like the smell of wood. I like the sound of a chisel with a chisel being hit by a mallet, the kind of rhythmic pulse of that action over and over again. I like the sound of the table saw. I love the smell of sawdust. As you can see, my studio is a mess. You'll see my shirt. This is my uniform. Every year at Valentine's Day, I make a gift. And usually the gift has to do with work I'm doing in the studio. This is 1971. That's the year we were married. And this one is 1992. So in 1992, I built this for every year of our marriage. I'm a bit of a loner, and I like the privacy of my studio. And over the years, I have had assistants to help me out on projects. And I've loved that too. But then if you have an assistant or if you have an employee, you then have to spend time to think about, what am I going to have that person do today? There's a luxury of working alone. I can come into my studio and mess around, make mistakes, and I don't feel the urge to accomplish anything. So I'm loose-minded, and when the times I've had assistants, sometimes I felt anxious. I said, I've got to figure out what to give them to do today so they're not bored. And therefore, it took me away from my own self. So I think, and maybe that's one of the reasons I moved away from a practice of architecture, which I must say I love architecture, and I've taught architecture and design most of my adult career, and I still continue to teach today at Parsons School of Design, where I'm now teaching product design. Formerly, I taught interior design, but for many years at Pratt, New Jersey Institute of Technology, as visiting critic at RISD, and now at Parsons, I always taught architecture, and I love that field. But I like being an outsider in that field, looking in on the profession as a kind of antagonizer, instigator, interrogator of the profession. So my work is about that. I wouldn't say my work is architecture. I used to think it was, but now I really feel that I am an artist, but the medium I'm working in is architecture. That is the material I work with. Some people work with clay, some people work with pigment, some with stone. My material is architecture, is program. Eating, sleeping, bathing, earth, air, fire, water, vegetation. That's the material I work with. I have 2 degrees, one from an undergraduate degree, Bachelor of Architecture degree from Rhode Island School of Design, and a graduate degree, a Master of Architecture degree from Pratt Institute. I have great respect for both of those institutions. And I think I couldn't be an artist without that background. Not the kind of art I practice. So much of my work has to do with the scale of the body as an extension of, well, as
scale in terms of bigness? Or?
Yeah, the body as a, it really has to do with clothing. But as an quote, as an architect who thinks of, sheetrock like this, or as fabric that sheathes our bodies, I keep moving the sheetrock closer and closer to my body, and it begins to be clothing. So I'm playing with that balance or ambiguity between clothing and buildings or architecture.
So houses and any kind of structure is kind of clothing for humans?
Exactly. But at what, it gets, as it gets closer and closer to the body, it starts to become pixelated and starts to become fabric-like. So that project back there, this one is very much in that spirit. This is called I Want to Become Architecture. And it's very much about my body. It's a self-portrait done in plywood. Plywood is a plainer material. It's not the material that my grandfather, who was a tailor, worked with. He worked with fabric. And so maybe I'm returning to my roots of being a tailor, but I'm thinking about how, as an architect, as an architect, do I tailor building materials to conform to the human body, slowly. So this piece, if you come around here, I could show you. This was done. So this is a self-portrait. Now this was done many years ago. So this you could say is perhaps 80 pixels per inch. I've gotten better with my craftsmanship, and I've gotten up to 300 pixels per inch.
More resolution.
It's higher resolution, and to a point where I've been working with, slowly moving toward fabric, and actually learned how to sew last summer. So I've been working with fabric and as a material to investigate extensions of the body and making sculptures out of fabric as well. This is actually meant to be an interior installation. The reason you see this raw edge here is when it gets installed in a museum or a gallery, this gets built into the building.
Oh,
so
literally,
then this gets sheetrocked and joint compounded, so it's contiguous with an entire wall. So you don't see the front and the back at the same time. You have to come around and say, there's a discovery that's made as you come around into another room. You see the back side. Yeah. I thought of building this into our house, but we just didn't have the room for it. I studied architecture. I guess I entered Rhode Island School of Design in 1967, graduated in 71, 72 maybe. The height of the Vietnam War, and as a young student in architecture, being exposed to the anti-war movement, I said, and it wasn't just me, other people, we felt really making more buildings, was that going to help culture? Adding more stuff to the world, building more buildings? Why can't we use what's already existing? Do we need to create more stuff? And so there was a movement, and there were I'm not the only person involved in this movement, it was called, paper architecture, or non-architecture, or anti-architecture, speculative architecture. And we were interested in using architecture as a language that could help change the political course of life, that could help us understand culture. We didn't need to make buildings, we could make proposals for buildings that could be made on paper and shown in galleries and published in journals that would help change the world as much as a physical building could. So we felt that making a proposal for architecture was as valid a practice as making a building. So I think a lot had to do with coming out of the, being a student, very vulnerable and impressionistic at that time, and being absorbed by the anti-war movement. Am I seeking immortality in my art? Absolutely. No one wants to leave this planet. There's so much to do. I think about that more as I get older. What does it mean to be immortal? What happens to all the work I've done over the years? Do I burden my daughters with this work? What's going to happen to it? I think about that a lot lately. But no, I enjoy the moment. There's nothing more wonderful for me to come into my studio in the morning and, as you saw, walk through the path in my woods from my house to my studio, come into the studio, smell yesterday's oil-based paint that's still lingering in the atmosphere, getting dirty from the sawdust on the chair that I'm going to be sitting on, and getting back to cutting, scraping, sanding, drawing, photographing, mixing plaster. That's what gets me going in the morning. And it's out of the making and out of the physical labor that ideas start flowing. Now, I'm sounding like this happens every day. I mean, there is struggle and there is emotion involved and questioning all the time. Is the work I did yesterday better than the work I'm doing today? Was the work I did as a student or as a young person or as a beginning, younger artist, was that more profound and more edgy and more controversial and more of an irritant than it is what I'm doing today? Am I in my comfort zone? Am I taking those risks? All of those questions still exist. So it's not all so much fun. But most of the time, I'm in another world when I'm working with my hands. And of course, when you're working with your hands, you're thinking constantly. So when I look back at the work I was doing in my 20s, it is not unlike the work I'm doing today. And I keep returning back to my work. At one point I thought, it's a mistake to repeat yourself. But as I get older, I think it is a good thing to go back, because then you realize, when you look back at your life, that you have very few ideas. But those ideas continue to evolve and change and evolve and change. And so I don't mind looking back. I'm still working on, work I did in my 20s had to do with human interaction. The way a person walks around a chair in space are still things that I'm working on today. So I keep, I don't know if I'm going back directly, but subconsciously, I keep returning to the work I did, not just in my 20s, but even as a child. I mean, the things I made as a little kid still are evolving in the work I'm doing as a 72-year-old. The word pixelated, I just think it's a kind of more and more refined as you get, quote, better and better. But I'm not interested in getting better and better with craft. I like the rusticity of handcraft, because in that, when it's not so slick, you see the artist's mind in operation, you see each step. Sometimes I find with fine furniture, for instance, it's so well crafted and polished that we lose the making. It's mysterious.
Is it important to show the making?
Well, I think either way, I think the mystery of the hidden making is good, but I also think revealing the making is good. So it's, you know, sometimes I'm all for mystery and sometimes I'm all for revelation in terms of process. And also, yeah, I think I call it a struggle, but it's a positive word in my mind. The struggle to work out ideas is not always so seamless. You know, it's somehow rustic.
It's a search.
And the word rusticity is a very good word in my mind. Book that I just had published, well, a few years ago now, by Lars Mueller, who's a wonderful publisher, called Absurd Thinking Between Art and Design. I think my wife Ellen came up with that title. And to be safe and make sure no one else used that title, she did a Google search on the word absurd thinking. And it was a quote from Albert Einstein, a scientist, not an artist, saying, if an idea is not absurd, there's no use for it. And so absurdity is what we try to push our work, because absurdity means it's not every day. It's not status quo. So a lot of the work that I try to push is the absurdity of it. And in doing so, people look at my work and say, you have a sense of humor. Well, I don't try to be humorous. The work is humorous because it's out of normality, and therefore it's pushing. So, you know, it's a typical term that I use, and I think a lot of teachers of design and art use, is push your ideas. What that means, and I tell my students this all the time, I say, when you have an idea and you think it's great, for the sake of experimentation, take that idea, establish it as a midpoint between two extremes. So if your idea is what you think is really hot, assume it's lukewarm, it's mediocre, it's middle of the road, and push it toward really hot and really cold, and push it into those. And when you get it really hot, assume it's lukewarm and push it more, and push it more, and push it, and push it, until you're exhausted from pushing so much. That's where innovation can happen. And I don't think this is just a matter of artists, but it's also a matter of scientists, is to push. And I always thought that it would be great, and if I was younger, I might pursue this more readily, is what it would be like to teach, like if I were an artist, to teach in a medical school, or as an artist, to teach in a school of philosophy or literature. What does that mean? Because the way artists think is perhaps would be helpful within the field of scientific research, because I think we're similar. I mean, when I read articles about the great scientists who have made real inroads and breakthroughs and innovation, they talk about the work they do very much the way artists talk about their work. It is serious play. It is playful. It's enjoyable. It's provocative. It's causing irritation. That's what is going to solve the world's problems, I think. Here is another piece that has to do with gravity. Water seeks its own level. All the glassware is interconnected with plumbing fixtures. So when you turn on the valve, water flows through the cups, but then always creates a level surface. The same thing with this project here, which is less than a year old. So these are pieces in the studio that are current, that haven't been seen in a gallery situation yet. And so again, imagine this filled with water, becoming this horizontal plane. Water is the only thing in nature that is truly horizontal. And that's kind of magical. I'm trying to...
Because of gravity.
Because of gravity. But I think as, you know, I always say that...
Like Bruce Lee said,
what?
Be water, my friend.
Oh, nice. I didn't know that.
You have to kind of like, you know, adjust.
Be water, yes.
Be water.
Flow with the, go with the flow.
Yeah.
As,
whatever shape.
Yeah, and also in
in.
Zen Buddhism, the idea of not interfering with the flow of life, and water and current. All of that, I think, has to do with some of these projects. that are here in the studio. Art is so important and so undervalued in American culture. You know, art is, most people consider it luxury. Even the New York Times, in the New York Times Sunday section, it's called Art and Leisure. It's not leisure. It's an essential, important aspect of life. It is meta life. It's the opposite of life. It's what helps us become humans. Emotion, spirituality, metaphysics, mythology, that is as important as nutrition and science and ecology. It's really important. It's so undervalued here in this country. Other countries have, you know, visual literacy is so critical. You would not be considered a citizen without being visually literate as you were verbally literate. So I think it's extremely important because it is a contrast to human function. But, you know, nutrition, biology, that's the inverse, and that helps us understand who we are as human beings. I think it makes us fulfilled as individuals. Maybe there's a selfishness there that we feel, why is it important who we are in relationship to the universe, or in relationship to each other, in relationship to our family, our friends? What is that relationship, interconnectivity between people? I think it's what makes us human. Maybe it's what distinguishes us from the animal kingdom, is art. Do animals make art? No. Maybe that's the difference, is an understanding of who we are in relationship to each other, and a relationship to who we are in relationship to the planet as well. And that's what art is helping us understand interconnections, interrelationships, and relationships. Relativity. There's another kind of relativity. What is taste? You know, it's so interesting. When I taught interior design for about 6 or 7 years in the graduate program at Parsons, and I've never practiced interior design, nor have I practiced product design, both of which I've taught, and I'm teaching product now, but you know, at least I've practiced to some extent architecture. But the issue of taste comes up a lot in interior design. And of course, we have to be so careful as designers that we're not egalitarian and that there's the right taste and there's the wrong taste. And you can't say, I don't like your taste. You can't say that. So it's about empathy. You have to respect where people are coming from, their backgrounds, their personalities, their childhood upbringing. That's what makes taste. And true respect for that is what makes great taste. We all have great taste. Tastemakers might do is help people see that there are other options in our life. I mean, I'm thinking of, maybe we could take a designer like Russell and Mary Wright, who were American designers in the mid-50s, right after World War II. They felt that they could help Americans develop a sense of good taste. And they sold these very beautiful ceramic dinnerware and furniture out of Macy's department store. They were the tastemakers of the 50s, as perhaps Martha Stewart is the tastemakers of today, who are trying to help people see that there are other options beyond the ones that you grew up with, that help us think about, in the case of dinnerware, what color will enhance the food better. So, you know, the issue of tastemakers, that, you know, there is a role for designers in helping to educate people to have, I wouldn't say better taste, but open up options for utensils, dinnerware, environment, interiors that might spark their emotional state, or to help them feel like a sense of awe when they enter their home or sit down to have dinner. I would say that my art is not political at all, and then I would say it is indirectly political. I'm not a political artist. My interest is not in politics, but interest in everyday life, and therefore politics does enter into it, I would say. I think perhaps, no, I don't think it is political. I'm not answering that very well, but I think if I thought about it enough, I think there is a political aspect to the work I'm doing, in that it is about human interaction and how people come together around a table and what that means. Hierarchy. Is it a circular table or is it a rectangular table? A huge difference. Now that's pure geometry, form making, but it involves politics. Who sits first? Who drinks that cup of coffee before your guest? Does the guest drink the coffee before the host? That is political. But is it directly politics politically? Not really. It's another kind of politics. It's about human politics, I think. Whenever a young person says, how can I make it as an artist? I say, buy real estate. Because it's liberating. I mean, I think Ellen and I knew that if I wasn't going to practice architecture, which is a source of income, and I was more interested in practicing from the point of view of being a fine artist or with a private practice without clients, I still needed to eat and have shelter. So we saved our money up and bought property in New York City, and that became our source of income. So it allowed me to not be concerned about making income on my work, and therefore that was liberating. Was that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know. It might have pushed me in another direction. I might have been maybe more successful financially with my work, but it was liberating to have a source of income without having to take attention away from my practice. So my great advice to young artists is buy real estate. And I'm being a little bit tongue-in-cheek there, but be yourself, obviously, and that's a cliche, but be honest, be yourself, be willing to take those risks. That's the most important thing, and have fun being an irritant. I try to get my students, this is really tricky within a university, I say, you need to learn how to fail, and you have to fail once a day to be a great artist or a great designer. That's really important. How do you get people to not be fearful of, in the case of a university, a grade, or in the case of professional, an artist's fee, that kind of thing. So how do you loosen up? It's about loosening up and not being fearful and taking those risks and coming close to, danger. This is really early, 1990. So that's quite a long time ago. And I've been interested in how people come together, in which architecture becomes a theatrical stage set to activate human interaction. But this one is about exterior and interior. In this case, the trees are excavated and the roots bring water from I'm connecting the roots of the trees outside to the table legs inside this building. So I'm making this connection between the wood of the table and the wood of the trees. For so many years, I didn't think of myself as an artist. And I still believe this, I thought of myself as an architect with an experimental, speculative practice. I had seen exhibitions at Ronald Feldman Gallery, and I knew of Ron's reputation as being a gallery that crossed boundaries. Before this term became a cliche called crossing boundaries, where artists were working within the field of architecture, architects were working in the field of art, Ron Feldman was representing artists who worked in the sciences, he showed Buckminster Fuller's work, who was one of the great masterful engineers / architects, but showed his architecture and showed his experimental structures within a gallery world. He showed, he was one of the early people to take on work of political action people, of performance artists. So this idea of crossing boundaries. So I approached James Wines, who was a member of the gallery at that time, who started out as a sculptor, but was an architect and was represented by Ron Feldman. So he introduced me to Ron Feldman. I showed him my work. I was very young. He said, come back in a year, show me more work. And then he took me on as one of his artists. So And my very first show in New York City was at the Drawing Center in New York City, where I brought architectural drawings to the Drawing Center, and they put me in an exhibition of my architectural drawings, which were called axonometrics of the typical house, in which I took the elements of a house and isolated them and created what is called axonometric drawings of those houses. That was the first time I showed work within the context of a fine art institution, but it was architecture, and it was looked at as an architectural drawing, but shown within the gallery world. That's where I thought the interest was for me, is showing architecture within a gallery. Originality. Is there such a thing as originality? Do we repeat ourselves? I remember once I did a project, and speaking about originality, and I took a box and I put a hole in it, and I had a light source, and I looked inside the box and there was an image inside. And I said, wow, I've created this dark room. And I said, that's a camera. I reinvented the camera. But I did it in a different way. And so, could you reinvent the wheel? Yes, we can. But originality, it's so interesting. If you take even a simple, let's say a Bach fugue, and you take a few phrases in music, there are so many variations on simple phrases, and it talks to human ingenuity. So there is room for originality, yes. I'm not sure that is a really good answer to the issue of originality, but do we repeat ourselves? And is it okay to repeat ourselves? And is it okay to be, maybe the difference is being inspired by someone and then turning it into your own.
So everything is a remix.
Yeah, everything is a remix. And sometimes the artifact can look almost exactly the same like another artifact, and yet they're coming at that result from totally opposite places, and somehow they intersect at that moment in time. So be careful of the artifact without seeing the trajectory of that work. I'm always reluctant to go into a gallery and dismiss a work of art and saying, oh, that's bad, without understanding the artist, the trajectory, their body of work. I can't dismiss that work and say, oh, that's not good. I want to see more and where he came from, or she came from. This is a new project just completed about a month ago, and it's dinnerware.
Is it a laser?
No, it's
something that shoots laser?
It's lighting. So imagine a dinner party. You're pouring wine. So imagine a dinner party in which you're having, people, you're sitting around a table and you're having dinner, but there's no light. It's completely black. Pitch black, and the only illumination comes from the dinnerware itself. So, and then you're seeing the light transmitting through a glass of red wine or white wine. So it begins to glow, and as you pick up the wine glass and you put it to your face, the wine is coloring your face. So it's visual and culinary simultaneously. So I'm trying to elevate the culinary arts into the fine arts in some of these projects. So
Have you put it to use?
Not
Like
yet, but I'm going
room?
I'm going to be staging a series of performances. So you can imagine even a coffee cup with light glowing from the interior of the coffee cup, and slowly you pour a cup of black coffee and it starts to get dim and the color transforms itself like a film.
Right.
So I'm trying to exploit everyday things that we don't think about: eating, sleeping, bathing. That's the material I work with. Being trained as an architect, that's what we work with. Earth, air, fire, water, gravity, eating, sleeping, bathing. That's the material, that's the media. You're a painter, but I'm a person who works with the medium of life, domesticity, and human interaction through architecture. I don't understand a lot of it. I don't understand finances when it comes to art and how pricing happens. So it's something I'm totally out of the picture with, and what makes art more financially valuable than other art is a mystery to me. It's something I'm not that interested in. I'm interested in artists whose work inspires me, where I see the passion and the conviction and the edginess and the experimentation and pushing boundaries, whether it's boundaries within the field of landscape painting or it's boundaries within the field of performance and sculpture, but it's about the edginess of continuous search within the work. But in terms of, so it's more about, that's what drives me toward the art. But in terms of the other side of the gallery world, which is the financial side, is still a mystery to me, and something I'm not that interested in. I'm interested in the work, not what happens, behind the work. Well, it took me a long time, and I'm not sure I realize I'm an artist today. I still think of myself, and I know I get into trouble with my wife who thinks I'm an artist, but I think myself still as an architect. I mean, I'm working within this field and I have a passion for it. I'm a designer, I'm an architect, but I somehow very recently came to terms and said, to be honest with myself, and maybe it had to do with when I was putting this book together of like 40 years of my work, that I realized, well, I'm probably not an architect. I'm an artist. The media is architecture. The material I work with is human life, domesticity, as I said. So I came to realize this quite recently.